I think the thing that you can say very simply and very truthfully is that every day the war continues, the situation for civilians gets worse, and the harder it will be to rebuild Yemen. A way to describe that is, in 2018, Muwatana for Human Rights, a Yemeni human rights organization which I work for, documented more than 150 coalition airstrikes that hit civilians or civilian objects. They documented indiscriminate shelling by the Houthis and government forces, the use of child recruitment, landmines, arbitrary detentions, disappearances, torture, as well as both sides interfering with and obstructing humanitarian assistance. And the reason I raise that is because when you ask, has the human rights situation gotten worse or gotten better, it's really important to realize that you can't disaggregate the human rights situation and the humanitarian crisis. And I think one of the reasons that Muwatana and others are calling so strongly for an end to the conflict is that you really do see on a day-to-day basis that where fighting comes, there is an impact on civilians, and as long as this war continues, the kind of destruction of the country will get worse and worse and worse. And I think a lot of people within Yemeni civil society are very worried about whether it will be possible to rebuild and what that looks like given how awful the situation is now, how much worse it gets, and in addition to sort of the more general human rights violations, you've seen this concerted effort to put pressure on and stymie and silence Yemeni civil society, which really would need to be a partner in rebuilding and in creating sustainable peace. I think the one thing to remember with the news around the UAE's withdrawal is that for years the UAE has been empowering local armed actors in Yemen, including some which not just us but the UN also classifies as UAE proxy forces. And those forces have immense power on the ground in Yemen, and they still do, sort of regardless of what the UAE troops themselves do. Those groups, the UAE proxy forces and UAE supported armed groups, are still controlling large areas of Yemen, still carrying out armed attacks. And even what you've seen in Aden in recent days is very much something that the UAE is a part of. So I think it's far too soon to say that the UAE has withdrawn from the conflict in Yemen, and the real question now is what role is the UAE going to play as things unfold both in the south and in the north. And unfortunately, what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is that the UAE has certainly not prioritized rights, and in fact has really increasingly pushed a PR narrative that is very different than the reality on the ground in Yemen in terms of what they're doing. I think one of the things that's actually been amazing about Yemen, if you can say anything in Yemen is amazing these days, is that you have very clearly seen that pressure from states like the US, including in the US Congress, have real world impacts on what's happening in Yemen. So one of the best examples of this is that when there was a huge amount of international outcry after Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, you had both the US Congress as well as other countries putting pressure on Saudi in particular to do something about Yemen. And that's not the only reason, but it certainly was a factor in why you saw in Stockholm the parties eventually come together. Unfortunately, the pressure coming from the US Congress is undercut by the completely counter messages that are being sent by the Trump administration in terms of sort of saying, do what you want to do, we're not going to push back. But what you have seen very, very clearly is that the pressure both from the US Congress when it comes to arms sales or military support, or the court case in the UK, or the decisions taken by other European states, the Saudis and the Emiratis are certainly paying attention. And I think that it's very, very clear that when that pressure increases, you see responses as well as more attention put on things like investigations or the way in which the aerial campaign is being waged, or even peace. The problem is we haven't seen it shift enough where the leverage has been enough to actually get us to what we want, which is an end to the conflict, an end to unlawful attacks, credible investigations, compensation for civilian victims. And so the sincere hope is not only that the US Congress maintains its pressure, but that that pressure will eventually force the Trump administration's hand to also put real and concrete pressure on the Saudis and Emiratis, for example, by suspending arms sales rather than overriding Congress, as well as for other European states, for example, the UK, to follow suit and end arms sales, because from our perspective, that is one concrete way, not the only way, but one concrete way to push a message of peace, of accountability, and that International humanitarian law matters, and when a partner continuously violates it, as the Saudi-led coalition has done, there will be real-world consequences, including, for example, an end to arms or military support, and we hope that sort of Congress continues on pushing that stream.